I can tell you now, I am probably the most concerned about a potential conflict in Ukraine right now than I have at any point since the start of this conflict. Right now, it is the most turbulent. And if there was going to be a spark, we might be seeing it right now. So many of you don't know what I'm talking about because a lot of this is breaking news. So I'll try to get into detail about exactly what I'm talking about. So for many of you that don't know, there is a certain region of Ukraine called Donbass. And now there is the Donbass People's Republic, which is a breakaway region, which has been supported by the Russian government and their little green men that we talk about all the time, right? The little green men is supporting it. And this has been going on since 2014, 2015, 2016. Ever since the invasion of Crimea from Russian forces, there's also been Donbass. And that is because the leader of the DNR, the separatist region that I was just talking about, has released a statement claiming that Ukraine is planning an offensive in Donbass. Civilians are being evacuated, and they're doing this because they believe, according to them, that the Ukrainian government is about to invade the region and try to take it back, since the Ukrainian government does not view their breakaway movement as legitimate. And that right there is why they're evacuating. So we're going to look at some footage, but then I'm going to give you my thoughts and the thought of anybody with 2 brain cells, okay? Because this is smelly on impact. This is highly suspicious immediately for a multitude of reasons. So first, let's look at air raids in Donetsk. Let's look at it. Air raid sirens, not air raids, actually. So this is just one part of a large evacuation to try to do of the whole area. They're trying to warn civilians that it's time to evacuate. And if you look at the streets leading to Russia, it looks like this. Specifically, what's happening is people are getting in buses, they're getting in cars, they're getting in whatever they can, and they're just fleeing. They're just leaving Donetsk in large amounts, trying to get to Russia. The motherland, so to speak, and they're fleeing on anything they can use to get there. And this is happening at the same time where explosions are being reported throughout Donetsk. Specifically, here's some footage of a burnt out car that was exploded. And on that burnt out car, if you look here is, I believe, another angle. And the DNR claim that an explosive was detonated in the vehicle to the head of the DNR forces. Now, we have no clue who did this. We have no clue why someone did this. When I say no clue, of course we have suspicions, but we don't know the specific people involved. We don't know if it was like Ukrainian agents. We don't know if it was the Donetsk, just like regions, military, whatever, like doing a false flag. We have no clue. We have no evidence presented. All we know is that there was an explosion, and the DNR said that there was explosion was detonated from within the vehicle, right? So we're seeing explosions, we're seeing evacuations, we're seeing air raid sirens, we're seeing the Donetsk People's Republic saying, hey, look out, this is bad. It looks like the Ukrainians are going to invade. The Ukrainians are coming. And here's a guy, good account on Twitter, I suggest you follow it, Woofers, @NotWoofers on Twitter, that talks about all the specific areas where evacuations are happening. He's showing pictures of people shuffling into buses as they flee over to Russia, people waiting to be evacuated to Russia, trying to get out of Donetsk as fast as possible. And this is a truck in the DNR just driving around, going to civilians saying, hey, evacuate, hey, evacuate. They're doing everything they can to get as many people as physically possible out of the DNR.
городе Дебальцево объявлена экстренная эвакуация. Не теряйте самообладание, не поддавайтесь панике, оповестите соседей о полученной информации. При следовании к месту сбора микрорайон Восточный.
They're speaking over speakers to civilians. That's what's going on here.
Дебальцевский многопрофильный техникум. Ориентир, бывшая ПТУ, номер. Внимание.
It's all the same footage. Like, all I'm showing you right now is going to be like people in cars in like dark streets with Russian text like leaving Ukraine. Okay, that's what you're gonna see. That's all the footage that is like here that I could show you, right? But let's talk about this pretext for a moment. Okay, the idea that the Ukrainians are going to invade Donetsk and the Donbass region specifically right now. You would have to be the biggest window-licking knuckle-dragger in the existence of the world to actually buy that. That the idea that Ukraine, after 7-8 years of conflict, has decided to retake the Donbass region right now, when Vladimir Putin and the Russian government at the same exact time have put 150,000 troops on the Ukrainian border in positions that could be used to launch an invasion of Ukraine. If you legitimately think that, I refuse to even interact with you on an intellectual level. I refuse to acknowledge your even existence on this planet. Because you are not a person engaging in good faith. You are not a person engaging in reality. There is no way, under any circumstances, the Ukrainian government would choose right now, when it has 150,000 troops on the border, to invade Ukraine. While it would be very funny from a historical narrative, maybe 1,000 to 2,000 years from now, somebody looking at the history books being like, wait, so they chose this moment to invade? That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. It'd be funny from like a historical perspective 5,000 years in the future, when all the blood and bones have been cleared and all the human tragedy of it has been moved away. It's a good fan fiction that's not going to happen. I will not give you any guarantees in this video besides one. That if there is a conflict that starts here, which could very much start at any moment, or it could not start at all. I am not a glass ball magician who's going to be able to tell you exactly how stuff is going to go down in the preceding days. I'm not. And if you came here waiting for my glass ball prophecy, I'm sorry, you're not going to get that. But there's one thing I can guarantee for you, and that is this conflict is not going to start with Ukraine invading Donbass in order to reclaim that territory, which it views as its rightful territory since the region separated in 2014-2015 after the invasion of Crimea by Russian troops that took off their markings. Anyway, somebody else put this in better words than me, and that was Michael West. The Kremlin and its surrogates are asking you to believe that after 8 years of not invading the occupied Donbass, Ukraine waited until more than 150,000 Russian troops were stationed at its border to do just that, with chemical weapons. You know what? Some of you will believe it. Oh, that's one of the elements that I forgot to bring up. They're saying that they're invading also with the use of chemical weapons. Weapons of mass destruction, if you will. Now, I'm going to be honest. I, again, try my best not to be a complete fucking hack. So I'm going to tell you right now, I have no clue about the depth of the chemical weapons allegations. I have no clue, and the only way we're going to get a clue is by waiting it out and seeing what investigators can find, if investigators are allowed to investigate. And that's what we're going to have to wait and see to do. And that's the responsible thing to do. Theories are people in the region going to ATMs to try to get money as much as they can so they can deal with the incoming possible conflict, have to wait it out, so to speak. And there's a bunch more footage of people evacuating, of people at gas stations, the explosions, and that's just what all this footage is. And I will say, there is one thing I want to bring up. There has been more violation of ceasefire agreements today and yesterday. It's been an intensification of violations of these ceasefire agreements. And one of the violations I want to point out particularly was artillery shells. And I'm not saying that the Ukrainian military didn't lob shells back at the Donbass region or at Donetsk. They 100% did. That's always how these violations of these ceasefire agreements go. But there was one instance that has particularly grabbed the attention of international observers that I wanted to highlight, because there was a kindergarten that was hit by, allegedly, pro-Russian forces in the Donbass region and the region of Donetsk. 10 minutes, exactly 10 minutes before classes were supposed to start, and it was going to be filled with Ukrainian youngsters. Let's look at the video before we move on to a wider perspective of Ukraine here.
We flew with Ukraine's military to the country's far east, under 10 miles from the Russian border, to the village of Stanitsa Luhanska, where Ukraine says Russian-backed separatists fired heavy artillery into civilian areas yesterday, including this school, ironically named Fairy Tale Kindergarten, a place of innocence now shattered. Children would have had a lesson in the room that was hit just minutes later, according to Yulia Semenko, who works at the school.
When you look at the damage here, it must have been terrifying for the children that were inside this building.
We were told none of the students were hurt, but Ukraine says 3 adults were injured. Ukrainian soldiers showed us where they said another artillery shell hit in the playground.
There were no children here at the time.
Yeah, they all were inside building on the second floor.
Okay, so this is the reason why I am very concerned about what's going on right now. Not only are we seeing an escalation of violence in this region, the region which has the most historical precedent for us seeing violence in the ongoing Ukrainian conflict, but we're now seeing that compounded by an evacuation. At the same time, there's 150,000 Russian troops, when Putin was saying, which might not turn out to be true anymore, that he was going to start evacuating troops. Now we're seeing more troops actually file in, just 150,000 on the border, and we're seeing conflict in Donetsk, and now an announced evacuation of Donetsk with reported explosions within the central parts of the DNR, I think specifically in Donbass. That right there is a pretext for an invasion. That's exactly what you would do if you wanted to invade. If you wanted to prepare that region for an invasion, you would evacuate it. If you wanted to prepare troops for an invasion, you would do everything that Vladimir Putin has done. Everything such as getting up medical equipment, getting all of his troops on the border, getting his people ready. This is something that I remember. I think there was a video by a very popular YouTuber. I forget his name, but he released a video with 4 million views on it. And he even had to correct himself at one point, where in the video he said, one of the things that makes me think that a war is not going to happen is that Vladimir Putin and his government and Russia Today and other news outlets like that haven't been pumping out the idea that Russia will invade, or Ukraine will invade, or that war could come, and that getting the people ready. But in the time that he recorded himself for the video and he released the video, that changed. And the government did start putting out that propaganda. That's another reason why I'm concerned. And so if there was going to be a conflict, which I am not going to tell you one way or the other, if there will be or if there won't be, This seems like, in my view, the time frame to do it. When you're evacuating, when you're saying, oh, look, terror attack. Oh, look, a bombing in the DNR. Oh, look, the Ukrainians are coming. The Ukrainians are coming. They've decided right now, with 150,000 troops on the border, now is the time. Bullshit. That's fucking bullshit. My camera's not working anymore. That's great. Oh, there we go. It's bullshit, though. I just don't believe it. Anyway, let's move on to my broader view of the conflict before we get back into specifics, right? Because I haven't talked about Ukraine much, and there's a reason why I don't talk about Ukraine much. I am not an expert on Ukraine, and I will not pretend to be an expert on Ukraine. And when thousands upon thousands of lives are at risk, and I'm talking about putting my own opinion out there, I'm going to wait a little bit, I'm going to watch, I'm going to wait for information to come out, and this right here is the clearest indication that a conflict really could start this time. Because this is not something that happens every other day. When Russia just starts allowing all of these people to evacuate, and they start evacuating all these people while filing all these troops in positions ready. The troops are currently in positions ready to cross the border, to strike. And they're pointing at terrorist explosions and alleging chemical weapons attacks by the Ukrainian government. Now, I don't even want to get into the whole chemical weapons angle of this again, because as an American, let me just say, the Russians are learning from the best. Okay, let's move on. When do we get a hippy dippy website? That's part of tonight's announcement. But I want to drag this back to 1994. Does anybody know what we're about to talk about here? Because I haven't seen many other streamers talk about this angle when we talk about this conflict. In 1994, there was the Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances. And they talked about a lot of things here, right? But one of the things that I want to highlight is what's the important part here. And that was, this was the agreement that allowed Ukraine to basically give up its entirety of its nuclear arsenal. And let me just say, that is a massive thing. That is a thing that hasn't really happened much in human history. In fact, the only other instance that I can think of where something like this happened was in South Africa. It was a major thing for a nation to willingly give up something that a bunch of other nations don't have in a time of instability after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when Ukraine didn't really know its future, didn't know how militarily secure it was going to be, did not know if its borders would be secure if they would give up their nuclear arsenal. But due to a bunch of different reasons, the Ukrainian government agreed to give up its nuclear arsenal. It agreed to because, number one, post-Soviet East was not exactly, how you would say, a booming time to be alive. It wasn't the roaring 20s. And running nuclear arsenals and keeping everything up to date and safe so you don't have a nuclear crisis on your hands. And a lot of Ukrainians remember, Chernobyl. It's quite, expensive. That's one reason. And another reason is the Ukrainian government would like to probably start on a good footing with the international community when it comes to how the international community views Ukraine. And giving up its nuclear arsenal like this would go a long way to benefit their relations with Russia and many people even in the West. And so for this, among other reasons, they give up their nuclear arsenal. Now, I'm not going to get into all the reasons, okay? The negotiations for this is kind of complicated. There's a lot of history for it. I recommend you all look into it yourself. But I'm not going to do this, mostly because we don't have the time to go through all of this. But there was one thing that Ukraine got as a guarantee with the fact that they signed and agreed to this and gave up their nuclear arsenal. And that was its territorial integrity. And a bunch of countries guaranteed they would not infringe on Ukraine's territorial integrity. Now, I'm not talking a verbal agreement. People a lot of times will bring up like and this is legitimate, like a legitimate thing to bring up. Like a guarantee of a stop of like NATO expansion that was brought up behind closed doors verbally between the West and Russia and, you know, post-Soviet Russia going forward, right? This wasn't a verbal agreement. This was written on paper. Written on paper. The Russians agreed, along with other countries, to not infringe on Ukraine's territorial integrity if they gave up their nuclear arsenal. On paper. Now, I have to say, I feel like the spirit of this agreement has not exactly been followed. And I would say that it has stopped being followed ever since 2014 in the Russian invasion of Crimea. And then you have, of course, Donetsk. And now you possibly have even more swaths of Ukrainian territory. They didn't hold to this. And so to me, not only could we talk about the sovereignty of Ukraine when it comes to its territory and its people, we could talk about the population of Ukraine and polling data clearly showing that the majority of Ukrainians not only want to join the European Union or join NATO, or are starting to elect more and more pro-Western politicians in response to recent Russian aggression. I gotta say, if Russia wants Ukraine to come back into its arms, into its sphere of influence, since Vladimir Putin views the countries as basically brother-sister countries, right? Being so aggressive towards Ukraine is not exactly the best way to earn the heart of the Ukrainian people. I am just going to be honest. But despite the Russian guarantee here, that guarantee was discarded. And it will possibly be discarded once again if there is a wider invasion of Ukraine. Now, I want to talk about a different view from this in the moment, right? Because the view from the Ukrainians is like a simple one. They don't want to be invaded. The majority of Ukrainians are starting to view the West more favorably. Both the European Union and NATO for protection reasons. They saw the invasion of Crimea as illegal. They see Russian involvement in the separatist movements within their country as illegal. And they see 150,000 troops building up on their border as evacuations are ordered. And they're scared that an invasion is happening. And their military is not as strong as the Russian military. It's not even as strong as the Russian military that is gathered on its border when it comes to updated equipment, or its capability to deal with all of the tanks or the Russian Air Force, or much of the capability that the Russians have. The only advantage the Ukrainians would really have there would be population. Not because the Ukrainian population is larger than the Russian population, but because they have probably more hands to spare in this specific conflict than the Russians do. Not saying that necessarily all those hands are even trained to fight, and many of them would be basically civilians, like quickly just taught how to like point and aim a rifle before being thrown to the front, possibly. Not as much as in 2014, but if it was a full-fledged Russian invasion, that would most likely play a part at some point. So the Ukrainian case is quite easy to understand. And I'm going to be honest with you, is the case that I agree with. Definitely when you take into account the Budapest Memorandum. Okay? So, that's my position. But let's flip our perspective for a second, and let's look at the Russian perspective for a second. NATO has expanded quite a lot, hasn't it? If you look at an image of NATO expansion, a lot of formerly Russia-aligned states, or specifically Soviet-aligned states, or even historically Russian-aligned states like Ukraine, right? There has been a lot of expansion when it comes to NATO. Countries that didn't used to be part of NATO that are now part of NATO post the collapse of the Soviet Union include Poland, Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic and Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and, half of Germany. There's been a lot of expansion. And to the Russian perspective, at least the perspective of the Russian government, this is threatening. This is scary. Now, if you go to Estonia, if you go to Latvia, if you go to Lithuania, and you ask them, should you be part of NATO, the people and the governments will overwhelmingly scream to the heavens, yes. Why? Because they're scared of what's happening to Ukraine right now. Troops on their border, possible invasion, possible aggression, or being dragged forcefully without their say in the matter back under Russian dominion. In places like the Czech Republic, the Soviet era isn't exactly remembered as fondly. Same in Romania to many people. Romania had a pretty brutal dictatorship. I don't want to get into the details of it, but I recommend a person I've worked for on a few occasions, State Senator James Rosapep. He used to be the ambassador to Romania, and he wrote a good book on it called Romania, called Dracula is Dead. I recommend it. But to the Russian perspective, this is seen as aggressive. Now, if you ask the population or the governments of said countries, they are doing it specifically because they're scared of what's happening right now in Ukraine, or what could have happened in Ukraine, and they wanted to ally more closely with the West and Western institutions. But to Russia, this is an infringement on what to them is historically their territorial sphere of influence, and is seen as a building of a circle, or at least a semicircle in this instance, around them. And so they're worried. From Turkey to Estonia. This map is out of date because it excludes North Macedonia and Montenegro. I appreciate my nerds in chat, but this is not meant for the nerds. But you are correct. My map is out of date. I just grabbed a random map off of Google. So that's the first part. The second part is the historical ties between Ukraine and Russia. And we're going to look at a specific article. Now, this article isn't written by Tim Pool. This article isn't written by Vice. This article isn't written by some random opinion columnist. This article is actually written by Vladimir Putin himself. And it's not really an article, and more like an essay. Specifically, an essay on the historical union between Russia and Ukraine. And in here, you can actually get a pretty good look at his perspective. And I remember trying to read this on stream a while ago, and I got bored midway through. But I want to highlight two sections that another YouTuber actually highlighted, which I do think are two sections that we can highlight for simplicity when trying to sum up the majority of this article. So let's read part of it. Again, remember, this is written by the man in the driver's seat in Moscow. During the recent... here it is. First of all, I would like to emphasize that the wall that has emerged in recent years between Russia and Ukraine, between the parts of what is essentially the same historical and spiritual space, to my mind, is our great common misfortune and tragedy. These are, first and foremost, the consequences of our own mistakes and made at different periods of time. But these are also the result of deliberate efforts by those forces that have always sought to undermine our unity. The formula they apply has been known from time immemorial: divide and rule. There is nothing new here. Hence the attempts to play on the national question and sow discord among the people. The overarching goal being to divide and then pit the parts of a single people against one another. Now, what he's talking about, this recent wall that divides Ukraine and Russia, you can probably point like a starting point on a lot of places, but I'm going to point the starting point to what most people would, and that is the Euromaidan protests, where a pro-Russian government was basically protested peacefully and pretty violently at times out of government. And they fled first to eastern Ukraine and just then straight out of the country. This happened for a bunch of reasons. A lot of it had to do with the deep ties that government had to the government of Russia. It also had to do with corruption. It had to do with a bunch of reasons. And if you want to learn more, go look at the Euromaidan protests. But this was the start of what we would likely see as more and more pro-Western government officials being elected into office and pro-Western administrations, all the way up to our reality television host president of Ukraine. Well, it wasn't reality television. It was a TV star host president of Ukraine that is sitting in office now that is very pro-West, pro-European Union, and pro-NATO expansion. And Ukraine has even taken some steps along the pathway to NATO expansion. And to Vladimir Putin, this wasn't the fault of that administration's corruption. That wasn't the fault of the people not being as favorable to the Russian ties. That wasn't the result of necessarily the failures. He acknowledged there were some failures. And if he acknowledges that there were some failures in an article written by Vladimir Putin himself, you know that there were plenty of fucking failures. I'm going to be honest. To him, it is a Western plot. Now I'm going to be honest. Would the West like more people in their military alliance? Well, yeah, probably. I mean, that's not a fucking surprise. Putin would also like Ukraine most likely in their military alliance. They would like other partners within their military alliance as well. Most nations that are part of military alliances would like their military alliance to be as powerful as possible. But ultimately, in my view, it is up to each individual country's sovereign decision to join Military Alliance A, Military Alliance B, the non-aligned movement, or nothing at all. Doesn't care. It is up to a country's and its people. Its people being its country, its government, elected. Who cares, right? It is up to their decision. But to Putin, Ukraine joining NATO would basically solidify that wall that has started building up ever since the Euromaidan protests and would continue NATO expansion, which he sees as a threat, and divide, and that's what the second part we're going to get into now of this we want to read on stream. Two historically united peoples. Let's read the second part of this. One second. Where is it? I gotta find it. The incumbent authorities in Ukraine like to refer to the Western experience, seeing it as a model to follow. Just have a look at how Austria and Germany, the USA and Canada live next to each other. Close in ethnic composition, culture, in fact sharing one language. They remain sovereign states with their own interests, with their own foreign policy, but this does not prevent them from the closest integration or allied relations. They have very conditional, transparent borders, and when crossing them, the citizens feel at home. They create families, study, work, do business. Incidentally, so do millions of those born in Ukraine who now live in Russia. We see them as our own close people. He's trying to make an appeal to something we can understand as Americans, to something that Germans or Austrians or Canadians that can understand. We have a very close relationship with Canada here in America. Many people have American fathers and Canadian mothers, or Canadian fathers and American mothers. There are Germans with German fathers and Austrian mothers, and Austrian fathers and Austrian mothers. And in fact, many of the leaders of the Soviet Union and many leaders currently in Ukraine, in local politics and in national politics, and in Russia, both in local politics and in national politics, and this was true for the Soviet Union as well, had Ukrainian mothers and Russian fathers. Gorbachev is actually someone I would point to who had a Ukrainian mother and a Russian father. And to us, the Canadians are also our hat, as somebody has brought up. And so I understand the appeal that's being made to. And I think it's a good appeal. But ultimately, and I think this is what most people would agree to, it is a nation's own sovereignty and its own decision to choose who it wishes to align with, both economically, militarily, culturally, and systematically, as in democracy or monarchy or whatever that it wants. It is a nation and its people's right to choose whatever that is. And that is why I don't believe Russia has the right to invade Ukraine, and Ukraine should be supported. There is one caveat, though, I want to put here. One itsy bitsy caveat. And that is the east of Ukraine is not as united with the rest of Ukraine in the messaging that I have put forward on what Ukraine's position is. If you go to eastern Ukraine, many of them are more likely to have Russian as their first language. And speak Ukrainian, but Russian as their first language. More documents and signs you're going to see is in Russian. They're more tied to Russia because, historically, and the border regions are more tied to Russia. Many of them are married to Russians, have Russian cousins, brothers, sons, and participate in Russian culture. And have Russian economic interests, as in they go across the border to get XY product, then come across the border the rest of the day to do XY thing, right? So many of them, Ukrainians, work in Russia. And there are Russians that work in Ukraine. There's economic ties established. And so if you look at Eastern Ukraine, and if you want to know Eastern Ukraine, if you look up a map of Ukraine right? We hit images. When I say Eastern Ukraine, this is actually perfect. I mean this area generally, right? That is the case. And therefore, you're going to see more support for separation from Ukraine, or more support for Russia and Ukraine remaining in extremely close ties than you're going to see in the rest of Ukraine. And therefore, most likely, more support for, if worse comes to worse, the Russian military if they cross the border. And in fact, this is the same area where you're going to see the Donetsk People's Republic, as you can see here, and the same also goes for 2014 in Crimea. Now, there was not an internationally recognized election in Crimea or a vote in Crimea when it comes to whether to separate or not, but the Russians did host one, and in that one they voted to separate. Now, a lot of people point to a lot of it being dubious. A lot of people talk to the fact that it wasn't internationally recognized. A lot of people say there was not a lot of really international monitors, and a lot of people said that people who wanted to stay a part of Ukraine didn't even participate because they didn't recognize it as legitimate, since it was annexed by Russia by force by the little green men with unmarked military uniforms in the middle of the night. And the Russian government lied about it the whole time until it was already too late to change anything, right? But there is a lot more support for close ties with Russia and or being part of Russia in Crimea than there is in the rest of the country. And so my one caveat is that in these areas, you are going to see more support for Russia. But this isn't exactly how you do things, right? This is not how you're supposed to settle these disagreements. You don't just invade countries in the middle of the night with unmarked uniforms. You don't just put hundreds of thousands of troops on the border and say, here are our demands, this is what you will do. This isn't how you're supposed to solve these types of conflict. And let me tell you, there isn't complete unity in the East either. Just like there isn't in the complete unity in the rest of Ukraine on the idea of joining with Russia and or support with the Russians. Just because somebody speaks Russian, and a lot of people try to paint this out as this is how it is, just because you speak Russian as your first language does not mean you agree with Vladimir Putin. And I gotta say, it actually sounds a little bigoted that a lot of people seem to think that way. The same goes in the other direction too, by the way. So, of course, the West has responded to this by sending military aid to Ukraine, by sending troops to Europe as part of a NATO response force. The other countries have sent aid to Ukraine, but there's not necessarily unity in NATO's position either, because Germany has actually tried to stop artillery from, I believe it was either Estonia, Latvia, or Lithuania, I forget specifically which country, from them sending German-made artillery to Ukraine as military aid. Germany has not been as exactly in lockstep with the rest of the coalition, and many people, including myself, would point to the fact that the German economy is extremely reliant on Russian gas. And they probably don't want to see, in the middle of winter, that Russian gas line be disturbed. It was Latvia. Thank you, somebody in chat, for reminding me. And so this has continued, and continued, and continued. Oh, there's also one other thing I should probably address here at some point. And this has to be with something that's been pissing me off a lot lately, because I see people talk about it as if Ukraine is like run by Nazis. Okay? And this is a point that I have, this is a caveat before we get back to like the current affairs, but I want to talk about this for a second. The Azov Battalion. The Azov Battalion is a battalion and a part of, now officially, the Ukrainian military that does have a lot of far-right ties. And I'm going to be honest, even straight-up neo-Nazi ties. It used to have more. It doesn't have as much anymore, but still does, if we're going to be completely honest. But this is the main, like, one of the main arguments I hear as to why, like, fuck them. Like, if you support Ukraine, you support Nazis, is basically the way I'm being sold to it. Even once on Twitter, I don't know if I have it, but I remember somebody sent me a picture, an edited picture, by the way. A lot of the pictures, like, actually going around about the Azov Battalion, just straight up edited, just fake. But an edited picture of the Azov Battalion saying, Dylan, the queer, supporting these Nazis. I don't think they would like you very much, Dylan. Now, the first thing I want to say is, I don't think the Russian government would like me very much either. I'm going to be honest. The Russian government is not going to invade Ukraine, bringing an ocean of LGBTQ plus, like, fucking, like, freedom, okay? Vladimir Putin and the Russian government is probably one of the most notorious governments in the world when it comes to hate crimes against LGBTQ plus people and just general hatred of queerness, right? So you're not really making a good case there for me. And I'm not betting where I support or don't support here based upon whether this side likes the gays or this side doesn't. That's not how it works, okay? Because there's a lot of countries that are mean to gays, right? But if America decided tomorrow that we were going to invade Central Africa because we were going to make it pro-gay, but by making it pro-gay, what I mean is we're going to annex all of Central Africa and make it an American state, or we're going to annex parts of Central Africa and make it an American state, I would be against that. Because that's not even what's happening here. But I would be against that too, okay? Because I'm going to be honest, I feel like in a lot of ways, that's actually just going to endanger the LGBT community of Central Africa because people are going to see them as agents of the American state. Anyway, completely separate conversation, but that shit was stupid. But there's also another problem with this. We have banned supporting the Azov Battalion for like 4 years now. It's been banned for like 4 years. So when I hear people, we're sending money to Nazis, we literally can't. It's banned. It's been banned for 4 years. This is a talking point we've heard for a very long time. But we've banned the American, because I see people in chat right there. You know the reason people are angry about that is because the US is actually sending them money and weapons. We are sending Ukraine money and weapons. We have banned arms to the Ukrainian militia. We have banned that. The weapons we're sending goes to the Ukrainian government. Okay? The times have changed. We're hearing arguments that have been, like, dealt with for fucking years now. Not to mention the fact that do you not think that the Russian government also has battalions that are notorious for doing some fuck shit? Do I even want to get into the accusation of war crimes from the Wagner group? Holy fucking shit. Torturing people with fucking sledgehammers and shit, man. And getting dunked on in Syria. But besides that, like, they torturing people. I don't even want to get into the fucking Wagner group, man. But the problem is here that the issue isn't the values of this or that military force. The problem is that it is one sovereign country saying fuck you to another sovereign country here. We're going to invade. And they're not invading to stop Nazism. And if they invaded, they wouldn't get rid of the Azov Battalion. It wouldn't get rid of the neo-Nazis. But here's another thing. People will say, oh, fuck. The Azov Battalion actually tried to do, like, politics, and they just got wiped. Because the Ukrainian people are not Nazis. They're not just a bunch of neo-Nazis. There are neo-Nazis within Ukraine, but there's also neo-Nazis within Russia. The argument is that the weapons still end up in the hands of Nazis that were incorporated, and they'll rise up like a Taliban-like fashion. It doesn't make sense, though, because they couldn't rise up in a Taliban-like fashion because they're not that fucking popular. The neo-Nazis in Ukraine are not that popular. The Azov battalions, let's look at the Azov battalion for a second. Azov battalion political party. Let's do this for like a fucking, just a nanosecond. Wow, man. Very popular. Very 0 out of 450. Great. Wonderful. They got wiped. You want to know how much of the vote they got? I think it was like 2% last time I checked. They're gonna develop the Fourth Reich any day now. I swear to God, guys. Any day, the Azov Battalion is going to, with its political arm, the National Corps, they're going to develop a neo-Nazi state any day now, man. Okay, it's coming. One of these days, it's gonna come. Okay, one of these days, they're gonna rise up and they're gonna take over. Bullshit. Get the fuck out of here. You're a window licker. I don't know what I'm saying to you. But let me tell you for sure, I fucking hate the Azov Battalion, and I don't think they should have been incorporated. I don't. Now, the Ukrainian government's argument is, in 2014, they were wildly unprepared, and they were willing to literally take the help of anybody in order to stop the Russian invasion. That's their argument, and that's the argument you'd probably still see today. I just want to give the Ukrainian government's argument. Anyway, I do want to bring up one other fact, and this is something that does bother me that the Ukrainian government does, it doesn't change my position on whether Russia should or should not invade, but it is something I want to bring up because I am giving you a generally what would be considered a pro-Western, right, position on this. And I want to give you information that I don't see a lot of people who take the pro-Western, quote-unquote, position on this, whatever the hell you want to call it. I call it, it's more to me, it's the pro-Ukrainian position, since it's their fucking country, but whatever. And that has to do with the Eastern Ukrainians, especially those within territory that is separatist, having to deal with water supply shortages due to the Ukrainian government not necessarily, wanting to give them water. Let's read a little bit of this. It's been 7 years. I think it's 8 now. It's been 8 years since the conflict first broke out in eastern Ukraine and made access to drinking water a struggle for millions. Today, continued shelling and armed clashes continue to endanger the water supplies of families in the region. For those who live along the contact line, cooking, hand washing, and access to clean drinking water are a daily challenge. Kindergartens, schools, and hospitals are also affected. Moreover, the relative isolation of cities and villages in Donetsk and the pronunciation, other place, has only intensified as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. These days, the Ukrainian checkpoint in the village of this place is usually deserted, but once a week it gets busy when local residents bring plastic containers and queue near a large white tank that bears the inscription, "Drinking Water." The checkpoint was closed to non-governmental controlled areas in March 2020 due to the pandemic. A pensioner who lives in the area. And we came to the checkpoint to get water. We have not had our own water for 7 years already. For the second consecutive year, drinking water has been supplied to the village by the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, in cooperation with charity organizations ADORA, as part of a project to provide water to settlements on the contact line in eastern Ukraine. This year, thanks to European Union humanitarian aid, the village will receive a cubic meter of drinking water every week, right? And so this is something I wanted to highlight especially because this is still an issue. And no matter if this conflict ends tomorrow and everything gets peaceful again, most likely this isn't going to change. And I wanted to bring this up because no matter how this conflict goes, the water security of people in eastern Ukraine, that situation isn't changing this way or that way, no matter what happens.